There is a part of the psyche that does not disappear when ignored. It does not weaken when denied. It does not dissolve when judged. It waits. Carl Jung called this part the shadow, not because it is dark in a moral sense, but because it exists outside the light of conscious identity. The shadow is everything you are, but do not recognize yourself as being. This definition is unsettling because it removes moral distance. The shadow is not an enemy, a flaw, or a sickness. It is a psychological fact produced by consciousness itself. Wherever there is awareness, there is exclusion. Wherever there is identity, there is rejection. The moment the ego says this is who I am, something else is implicitly declared not me. That excluded material does not vanish. It is pushed into the unconscious, where it remains active. The shadow is born not from evil, but from adaptation. As a child, you learned which traits were acceptable, which emotions were rewarded, which impulses led to connection, and which led to withdrawal, punishment, or shame. The psyche responded intelligently. What threatened belonging was suppressed. What secured attachment was emphasized. This process was necessary. Without it, there would be no social self, no coherence, no stability, but adaptation always involves costs. What is rejected does not cease to exist, it changes location. It moves underground. The shadow contains everything that did not fit the image you had to become. This includes anger in those who had to be agreeable, power in those who had to be compliant, vulnerability in those who had to be strong, creativity in those who had to be practical. It also includes positive qualities. This is crucial. Many people assume the shadow is composed only of destructive impulses. Jung was clear that this is false. The shadow is morally neutral. It contains life, energy sometimes raw, sometimes immature, sometimes dangerous, sometimes essential. What defines the shadow is not its content, but its exclusion. The ego fears the shadow not because it is bad, but because it threatens identity. To recognize the shadow is to admit that the conscious self is partial, not whole. This admission feels destabilizing. The ego wants clarity. It wants consistency. It wants a stable narrative it can defend. The shadow disrupts this by introducing contradiction. I am kind, but I am also cruel. I am principled, but I am also opportunistic. I am strong, but I am also afraid. These contradictions are true simultaneously. The ego prefers one side. The shadow insists on both. When the shadow is ignored, it does not remain quiet. It becomes autonomous. It acts without permission. It appears in moments of emotional intensity, fatigue, stress, or intoxication, when conscious control weakens, sudden rage, cruel humor, compulsive behavior, uncharacteristic decisions. These moments feel foreign because the ego has no relationship with the material that produced them. The person says, "That wasn't me." Psychologically, it was. Jung observed that the more virtuous the conscious attitude, the darker the shadow tends to be. This does not mean virtue is wrong. It means that one-sidedness creates compensation. If the ego insists on being only good, the shadow carries the capacity for evil. If the ego insists on being rational, the shadow carries irrationality. If the ego insists on being spiritual, the shadow carries instinct. The psyche seeks balance. The shadow is how balance is restored when consciousness refuses it. This restoration is not gentle. What is repressed returns distorted. What is denied returns exaggerated. The shadow does not express itself with nuance, it erupts. This is why moral certainty is psychologically dangerous. The more convinced someone is of their purity, the less aware they are of their capacity for harm. Jung warned that unconscious shadows, when activated collectively, produce the worst human atrocities. But the shadow is not only destructive, it is also the source of vitality. Contained within the shadow is spontaneity, creativity, assertiveness, sexuality, ambition, and emotional depth. These energies were not rejected because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient or unsafe at an earlier stage of life. The tragedy is not that the shadow exists. The tragedy is that it remains unlived. An unlived shadow turns against the personality. It sabotages relationships. It distorts perception. It fuels projection. It creates enemies where there are none. The shadow becomes fate. Jung believed that the first step towards psychological maturity is not enlightenment, positivity, or self-improvement. It is shadow recognition. Recognition does not mean indulgence. It does not mean acting out. It does not mean justification. It means acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the psyche is larger than the ego. Acknowledgement that moral identity is incomplete. Acknowledgement that what you dislike most may belong to you. This acknowledgement is humbling. It dissolves superiority. It complicates judgment. It deepens responsibility. The shadow refuses to die because it carries life that consciousness has not yet integrated. It persists until it is seen or excused, not celebrated, but related to. Only what is related to can be transformed. The shadow does not demand obedience. It demands attention. And until that attention is given, it will continue to appear in behavior, in dreams, in relationships, in conflict, as the part of you that refuses to disappear simply because you decided not to see it. When the shadow is not recognized inwardly, it is encountered outwardly. This encounter feels convincing because it is emotional. The reaction arises immediately, often with certainty and intensity. Someone irritates you deeply. Someone else fascinates you beyond reason. A group feels threatening, immoral, or corrupt. The ego experiences these reactions as responses to reality. Carl Jung understood them differently. He saw them as signs of projection, the process by which unconscious material is experienced as belonging to others. Projection is not a mistake. It is a psychological necessity. The ego cannot relate consciously to what it does not yet recognize as its own. The psyche solves this problem by placing the material outside. In doing so, it preserves identity while allowing the shadow to remain active. What is projected feels alien. They are aggressive. They are selfish. They are immoral. They are weak. These judgments feel obvious because they are charged. The intensity is the clue. When a reaction far exceeds the situation, something unconscious is involved. Projection simplifies inner conflict. Rather than holding contradiction, I am capable of this. The ego resolves tension by locating the capacity elsewhere. The self-image remains intact. The world carries the burden. This mechanism explains why moral outrage is so intoxicating. Outrage provides certainty. It provides superiority. It provides relief from inner ambiguity. The shadow is heavy. Projection lightens the load, but it does so at a cost. When projection dominates perception, the world becomes distorted. Others are no longer encountered as individuals, but as symbols carrying unconscious material. Relationships flatten. Curiosity disappears. Dialogue collapses into judgment. Jung observed that projection thrives where identity is rigid. The more the ego insists on being a particular kind of person, the more it must deny its opposite. That denied opposite does not disappear. It seeks visibility. If aggression is denied, aggressive people appear everywhere. If dependency is denied, needy people provoke contempt. If ambition is denied, successful people trigger resentment. These reactions feel justified because they reveal real traits. The problem is not that the traits exist. The problem is the exclusivity. The ego sees the trait only in others. This exclusivity prevents growth. As long as the shadow is carried by the world, the ego has no reason to change. It can remain innocent while condemning others. Responsibility remains external. Projection also explains idealization. Not all projections are negative. Sometimes the shadow carries unlived potential. The ego encounters someone who seems extraordinarily confident, creative, powerful, alive. Fascination follows. This fascination reveals something essential. The admired qualities are not foreign. They are possibilities the ego has not yet claimed. Idealization feels uplifting at first. It offers hope without effort. but over time, it creates dependency. The admired figure carries what the ego refuses to develop. When the projection breaks as it always does, disillusionment follows. The shadow returns with force. Jung believed that withdrawing projection is one of the most difficult psychological tasks. It requires humility. The ego must accept that what it condemns or idealizes is psychologically related. This acceptance does not mean equivalence. To recognize aggression within is not to act aggressively. To recognize envy is not to indulge it. To recognize desire is not to obey it. It means taking responsibility for the capacity. Responsibility restores choice. When projection is withdrawn, perception changes. Others become more complex. Reactions soften. Moral certainty weakens, but understanding deepens. The ego no longer needs enemies to define itself. This does not make life harmonious. It makes it real. Conflict still exists. Differences remain, but the stakes are reduced. The psyche no longer fights itself through the world. Projection is not eliminated through insight alone. It recedes gradually as the ego builds a relationship with the shadow. Each time a strong reaction appears, it becomes an opportunity, not for self-condemnation, but for inquiry. What part of me is active here? What am I refusing to recognize? What energy is asking for integration? These questions weaken projection because they reintroduce inner dialogue. Jung believed that the world becomes less hostile as inner conflict is owned. This does not mean people become better. It means perception becomes less distorted. The shadow, once externalized, returns home. And when it does, the ego gains something rare: the ability to see others without needing them to carry what it cannot yet face. This is not forgiveness. It is clarity. Clarity that restores proportion. And proportion is what allows psychological life to proceed without constant escalation internally or collectively. Projection is how the shadow first announces itself. Integration begins when that announcement is finally heard, not as accusation, but as invitation. When the shadow is ignored long enough, it stops knocking. It takes over. Carl Jung used the term shadow possession to describe moments when unconscious material overwhelms the ego and expresses itself directly, without mediation or reflection. This possession does not feel foreign while it is happening. It feels right. That is what makes it dangerous. In shadow possession, the ego does not experience itself as losing control. It experiences itself as finally justified. Behavior that would normally be questioned feels necessary, even virtuous. Cruelty feels like honesty. Aggression feels like strength. Domination feels like justice. The ego tells itself a story. This is who I really am when I stop pretending. In reality, this is who the ego becomes when it is no longer in relationship with the unconscious. Shadow possession occurs most often under conditions where conscious control is weakened. Exhaustion, intoxication, stress, humiliation, or moral certainty. These states loosen the ego's capacity to reflect, allowing repressed material to surge forward. The transition can be sudden. A calm person explodes. A disciplined person acts recklessly. A moral person becomes ruthless. Afterward, the individual may feel confusion, shame, or disbelief. They say, "I don't know what came over me." Psychologically, something very specific happened. The ego lost its mediating function. Jung emphasized that the shadow does not seek expression because it is evil. It seeks expression because it has been excluded. Possession is not rebellion, it is compensation. What has been denied returns in exaggerated form. If anger has been repressed, rage appears. If desire has been suppressed, compulsion emerges. If power has been denied, domination erupts. The psyche does not reintroduce balance gently when consciousness refuses it. Shadow possession reveals the cost of moral rigidity. The more the ego identifies with a single moral stance, the less aware it becomes of its opposite. This creates vulnerability. The shadow accumulates energy in the unconscious, waiting for a moment when it can act. This is why people who pride themselves on self-control often experience the most destructive lapses. Their control was reabut. Jung warned that the greatest danger is not having a shadow, but being unaware of it. Awareness creates distance. Distance allows choice. Without awareness, the shadow does not appear as part of me. It appears as what must be done. This is possession. Possession does not announce itself as pathology. It announces itself as necessity. This is why it is so convincing. In collective settings, shadow possession becomes even more dangerous. Individuals merge into groups, and responsibility diffuses. Actions that would feel unthinkable alone feel acceptable, even required, when shared. The group carries the shadow. Jung saw this dynamic at work in mass movements, ideological extremism, and moral crusades. When the collective identifies itself as purely good, the shadow is projected onto an enemy. Violence becomes righteous. Cruelty becomes duty. On the individual level, shadow possession often appears in relationships. Someone who avoids conflict suddenly becomes cutting and cold. Someone who avoids dependency suddenly becomes controlling. Someone who avoids vulnerability suddenly withdraws completely. These shifts feel drastic because the ego has not built a conscious relationship with the energies now expressing themselves. The goal is not to eliminate the shadow. That is impossible. The goal is to prevent possession. Prevention requires recognition before eruption. It requires noticing early signals: irritation, contempt, envy, moral rigidity, fantasies of domination or revenge. These signals are not failures. They are warnings. When the ego notices them and reflects rather than acts, the shadow loses its compulsive force. Energy remains available, but it is no longer autonomous. Jung believed that shadow possession is reduced not by discipline alone, but by integration. Integration means allowing the ego to say, "I am capable of this," without acting it out or identifying with it completely. This acknowledgement restores balance. The ego regains its mediating role. The shadow remains present, but contained. Behavior becomes deliberate again. Possession thrives where denial is absolute. It weakens where consciousness intervenes. The shadow does not demand obedience. It demands recognition. When recognized, it no longer needs to seize control. Shadow possession is not evidence of moral failure. It is evidence of psychological imbalance. An imbalance can be corrected, but only when the ego accepts a difficult truth. What you deny does not disappear. It waits, and when it returns with the authority you refuse to give it consciously. Recognition takes that authority back, not to dominate the shadow, but to relate to it. That relationship is what keeps the psyche human rather than possessed. And it is one of the central tasks of psychological maturity. Not all shadows look the same. One of the most damaging misunderstandings about the shadow is the belief that it is purely destructive. Jung made a crucial distinction between different forms of shadow material, particularly between the moral shadow and the creative shadow. Failing to distinguish between them leads either to repression or to chaos. Carl Jung observed that the moral shadow contains traits the ego judges as unacceptable. These traits often conflict with conscious values: selfishness, aggression, envy, manipulation, cruelty, or indifference. The ego rejects these traits to preserve a coherent moral identity. This rejection feels justified. The problem arises when the rejection is absolute. When the ego insists, "I am not capable of this," awareness collapses. The trait does not disappear. It becomes autonomous. The person becomes blind to how and where it operates indirectly. The moral shadow is dangerous when it is unconscious. But there is another kind of shadow that is often misunderstood and unnecessarily suppressed: the creative shadow. The creative shadow contains qualities that are not immoral, but inconvenient. Assertiveness in those taught to be agreeable. Ambition in those taught to be humble. Sensitivity in those taught to be strong. Originality in those taught to conform. These qualities are often exiled not because they are wrong, but because they threaten adaptation. They complicate relationships, they challenge expectations, they disrupt stability. The ego learns early that expressing them has consequences. So they are buried. The tragedy is that when the creative shadow is suppressed, vitality is lost, life becomes safe but thin, meaning diminishes not because values are wrong, but because energy has been sacrificed for order. Jung believed that many forms of depression and apathy originate here not in moral failure, but in the repression of creative shadow material. The psyche starves. People often confuse this starvation with virtue. They pride themselves on restraint, discipline, or modesty, while feeling increasingly empty. They assume this emptiness is the price of maturity. It is not. It is the price of unlived life. The moral shadow demands ethical reckoning. The creative shadow demands expression. Confusing these demands creates imbalance. When the ego treats all shadow material as dangerous, it over-controls. It becomes rigid. It fears spontaneity. It equates aliveness with risk. When the ego romanticizes the shadow, it indulges. It justifies impulses without reflection. It mistakes expression for integration. Neither path leads to wholeness. Integration requires discrimination. Discrimination means asking, what kind of shadow is this? Is this an impulse that requires containment and reflection? Or is this a capacity that requires development? Aggression may need regulation. Assertiveness may need expression. Envy may need reflection. Ambition may need acknowledgement. Jung emphasized that ethical development does not come from denying darkness, but from becoming conscious of it. At the same time, creative development does not come from rebellion, but from reclaiming suppressed potential responsibly. Both forms of shadow demand attention. They demand different responses. The ego often prefers moral certainty because it feels clean. It knows where it stands. The creative shadow disrupts this certainty. It introduces desire, risk, and uncertainty. This is why many people unconsciously sabotage their own growth. They interpret creative impulses as moral failures and suppress them, believing they are being virtuous. Over time, resentment builds. The psyche resists a life that denies its own expansion. Jung believed that one of the great tasks of adulthood is learning to tolerate the tension between order and vitality. Too much order suffocates life. Too much vitality destroys structure. The shadow sits precisely at this boundary. The moral shadow reminds the ego of its capacity for harm. The creative shadow reminds the ego of its capacity for growth. Ignoring either produces imbalance. When the creative shadow is integrated, life regains color, energy returns. Choices feel meaningful again. This integration does not require abandoning values, it requires refining them. Values that cannot accommodate growth become dogma. When the moral shadow is integrated, humility deepens. Judgment softens. Responsibility increases. The ego no longer needs to project evil outward to feel good. Both integrations reduce fragmentation. The psyche becomes less divided between what is allowed and what is alive. Jung did not promise comfort through shadow work. He promised depth. Depth comes from holding contradictions consciously rather than resolving them prematurely. It comes from recognizing that goodness without darkness is naive, and creativity without responsibility is destructive. The shadow, in both its forms, is not an obstacle to maturity. It is a condition of it. What matters is not whether the shadow exists, but whether it is known. Only what is known can be chosen. And only what is chosen consciously can become part of a life that is whole rather than merely controlled. When the ego learns to differentiate moral shadow from creative shadow, it stops fearing the dark indiscriminately. It learns where to restrain and where to allow. That discernment is the beginning of wisdom. The shadow does not belong only to individuals. It also belongs to groups, cultures, and entire societies. Carl Jung was explicit about this. Whenever individuals form a collective identity, a collective shadow emerges. What the group defines itself as not being becomes concentrated in an enemy, an outcast, or a scapegoat. The mechanism is the same as in individual psychology. A group says, "This is who we are." Implicitly, it also says, "This is what we are not." That rejected nodus does not disappear. It is projected outward, where it becomes embodied by another group, ideology, class, or figure. The collective shadow is powerful because responsibility is diffused. When individuals act within a group, conscience weakens. Actions feel justified not by inner reflection, but by shared belief. What would feel cruel alone feels acceptable, even necessary, when done in the name of the collective. This is how ordinary people participate in extraordinary harm. Jung did not see this as a flaw of certain cultures. He saw it as a psychological law. Every collective identity generates a shadow proportionate to the strength of its self-image. The more virtuous the group believes itself to be, the darker the shadow it must project. Moral certainty is especially dangerous at the collective level. When a society identifies itself as enlightened, rational, moral, or chosen, it becomes blind to its own capacity for violence. That capacity does not vanish. It is assigned elsewhere. The enemy becomes evil. The outsider becomes corrupt. The dissenter becomes dangerous. At this point, dialogue collapses. The group no longer sees individuals, it sees symbols. People are reduced to carriers of projected shadow material. Jung warned that this process accelerates under conditions of fear, humiliation, or rapid change. When a society feels threatened, its tolerance for ambiguity disappears. Complexity is experienced as weakness. Simplistic narratives gain power. Good versus evil replaces understanding. The collective shadow feeds on emotional contagion. Fear spreads quickly. Anger intensifies. Righteousness amplifies. The individual ego, submerged in the group, feels relieved of responsibility. Actions are no longer personal choices. They are duties. This is possession on a mass scale. History provides countless examples, but Jung insisted that the danger is never confined to the past. The collective shadow is not defeated by progress or education. It is restrained only by consciousness. When individuals withdraw projection within a group, they become uncomfortable presences. They disrupt certainty. They introduce doubt. For this reason, they are often marginalized or attacked. The group senses a threat not to safety, but to cohesion. Jung believed that the greatest ethical responsibility rests with the individual who resists unconscious participation, not through rebellion, but through refusal to dehumanize. Refusal to reduce others to symbols. Refusal to outsource conscience. Refusal to equate belonging with righteousness. This refusal is costly. It often results in isolation, misunderstanding, or exclusion. Yet without it, societies drift toward repetition, reenacting the same patterns of scapegoating, polarization, and violence under new names. The collective shadow thrives on amnesia. Each generation believes it is different. Each believes it has transcended the past. Meanwhile, the same psychological mechanisms operate beneath new language and new technologies. Jung warned that modern societies are especially vulnerable because they underestimate the power of the unconscious. Rational explanations give a false sense of control. Moral language gives a false sense of purity. The shadow is not impressed by either. Integration at the collective level does not mean moral relativism. It means recognizing the capacity for harm within one's own group and oneself. It means holding power with humility and restraint. This is difficult because it offers no emotional payoff. There is no righteousness in it, no certainty, no enemy to defeat. There is only responsibility. Jung believed that the future of civilization depends not on ideology, but on individual psychological development. Only individuals who have confronted their own shadow can resist being swept into collective possession. Such individuals do not become saints. They become limits. Limits to cruelty, limits to certainty, limits to dehumanization, The collective shadow cannot be eliminated, but it can be contained when enough individuals refuse to project blindly. This containment is fragile. It must be renewed constantly. Every crisis reactivates the shadow. Every fear tempts projection. The question is not whether the shadow will appear. It is whether it will be recognized. When recognition fails, societies repeat their darkest chapters while believing themselves justified. When recognition succeeds, even partially, history slows its repetition. The collective shadow reminds us of a truth that is uncomfortable but necessary. No group is innocent. No cause is pure. No identity is complete. Only individuals who accept this inwardly can prevent it from becoming destructive outwardly. The shadow belongs to all of us. And until that is acknowledged, it will continue to act not as fate, but as consequence. The goal of shadow work is not elimination. It is relationship. Carl Jung was explicit on this point. The shadow cannot be destroyed, cured, or transcended. Any attempt to do so only drives it deeper into the unconscious, where it gains autonomy. Integration means something far more demanding. It means allowing the ego to remain conscious in the presence of what it would rather deny. This requires a fundamental shift in attitude. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this?" the ego must ask, "What is this asking of me?" This question changes everything. When the shadow is approached as an enemy, it responds with resistance. When it is approached as a fact of the psyche, it begins to communicate. Communication does not arrive as clear instruction. It arrives as tension, anger without a target, desire without permission, fear without obvious cause. These experiences feel uncomfortable because they disrupt the ego's preferred narrative. They introduce ambiguity where certainty once lived. Jung believed that the ego's task is not to resolve this ambiguity quickly, but to hold it. Holding tension without acting it out or suppressing it is one of the most difficult psychological skills to develop. The ego wants relief. It wants resolution. The shadow offers intensity, not clarity. Yet intensity contains information. Anger may reveal violated boundaries. Envy may reveal unlived potential. Resentment may reveal chronic self-betrayal. If these signals are immediately moralized or dismissed, the information is lost. If they are acted out blindly, the psyche becomes chaotic. Integration happens in the middle. The ego acknowledges the impulse without obeying it. It allows the feeling to exist without turning it into identity. This creates space. Space restores choice. Jung emphasized that integration does not make the personality morally pure. It makes it conscious. Consciousness does not remove darkness. It prevents possession. A conscious shadow is less dangerous than an unconscious one. This is why people who have acknowledged their capacity for harm are often gentler than those who insist on their goodness. Awareness introduces restraint. Integration also restores energy. Much of the psyche's vitality is trapped in the shadow. When that energy is reclaimed consciously, life becomes more animated. Creativity returns. Assertiveness strengthens. Emotional range widens. This does not happen explosively. It happens gradually, through repeated encounters with discomfort. The ego learns that it can survive contradiction. It can be kind and angry, moral and tempted, responsible and desirous. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They coexist. Integration means refusing to simplify the self. This refusal is costly. It dismantles moral superiority. It weakens certainty. It complicates identity, but it also deepens responsibility. When the ego recognizes its shadow, it can no longer outsource blame entirely. It must reckon with its own participation in harm, avoidance, and self-deception. This reckoning is sobering. Jung did not romanticize it. He believed that facing the shadow is one of the most painful tasks of psychological life. Many avoid it not out of laziness, but out of fear of what they might find. What they find is usually not monstrosity. It is humanity. Humanity stripped of idealization. Integration does not mean expressing everything. Some impulses must remain restrained. Some desires must remain symbolic. Consciousness does not remove ethical responsibility, it sharpens it. The difference is that restraint becomes a choice rather than a repression. The ego no longer says, I am not capable of this. It says, I am capable of this, and I choose otherwise. This choice is meaningful. It restores dignity to morality. It replaces innocence with accountability. Jung believed that this form of morality born of awareness, rather than denial, is the only kind that can withstand pressure. It does not collapse under stress because it is not built on illusion. Integration also changes how others are perceived. When the shadow is owned, projection diminishes. The world becomes less charged. Enemies become human again. Admired figures lose their magical aura. This does not flatten experience. It clarifies it. The ego no longer needs the world to carry what it refuses to see. Relationships become less dramatic and more real. Integration is never complete. The shadow evolves as life changes. New roles create new exclusions. New identities generate new shadows. The work renews itself at every stage. Jung did not promise wholeness as a final state. He described it as an ongoing process of negotiation between consciousness and what lies beyond it. The shadow remains a companion, not a ruler, not an enemy. It reminds the ego of its limits. It challenges its certainties. It keeps the psyche honest. When related to consciously, the shadow no longer needs to erupt or possess. It participates. And participation rather than domination is what allows the psyche to remain whole without becoming rigid. Integration does not make life comfortable. It makes it true. And truth, in Jung's sense, is not a conclusion. It is a relationship that must be renewed every time the ego is tempted to believe it is complete. The shadow does not announce itself as theory. It announces itself as reaction. A tightening in the chest. A surge of irritation. A sudden certainty that someone else is wrong. This is why shadow encounters feel personal. They bypass reflection and strike directly at identity. Carl Jung emphasized that the shadow is experienced most strongly where the ego is least flexible. The more invested you are in a particular self-image, the more threatening its opposite feels. The reaction is not random. It targets the fault lines of identity. If you define yourself as rational, irrationality provokes contempt. If you define yourself as kind, cruelty enrages you. If you define yourself as independent, dependency disgusts you. These reactions feel moral. They feel justified. They feel true, but their intensity reveals something else. They protect an identity that feels fragile. The shadow feels personal because it is close. It touches traits that were once yours, or could have been, or still are, beneath the surface. The ego experiences this proximity as danger. To admit the shadow is to admit similarity. Similarity threatens separation. Separation protects identity. This is why people often react more strongly to those who resemble them than to those who are clearly different. The shadow recognizes itself. Jung observed that the shadow is rarely abstract. It is specific. It attaches itself to concrete situations, people, and behaviors that mirror inner conflict. A colleague's arrogance triggers disproportionate anger. A friend's weakness produces contempt. A stranger's freedom provokes envy. These reactions are not signs of moral clarity. They are signs of unintegrated material. The ego experiences them as attacks because it is defending a narrative. The shadow disrupts that narrative by suggesting, "This also belongs to you." That suggestion feels unbearable. So the ego doubles down. It judges harder. It distances faster. It moralizes more aggressively. The shadow feeds on this resistance. The more the ego insists on separation, the more forcefully the shadow demands recognition. This dynamic explains why shadow work is often avoided. It feels destabilizing. It undermines certainty. It complicates self-respect. People fear that acknowledging the shadow will lead to self-loathing or moral collapse. Jung argued the opposite. What leads to collapse is unconsciousness. A shadow that is not acknowledged becomes tyrannical. A shadow that is recognized becomes informative. The personal nature of the shadow also explains why advice rarely helps. Shadow material cannot be reasoned away. It is not accessed through logic, but through experience. No one can convince you that your reaction is disproportionate. You must discover it. This discovery often comes through repetition. The same conflict appears in different forms. The same irritation resurfaces with different people. The same emotional spike returns despite changed circumstances. The pattern reveals the psyche's persistence. At some point, the ego may begin to wonder, why does this keep happening? That question marks a shift. Curiosity replaces certainty. Curiosity weakens the shadow's grip because it introduces consciousness. The reaction is still felt, but it is no longer obeyed automatically. This pause is crucial. In the pause, the ego can ask, what does this say about me? What part of myself is being touched? What am I defending? These questions are uncomfortable because they redirect attention inward. They remove the safety of blame, but they also restore agency. Jung believed that shadow integration begins the moment the ego recognizes that its strongest reactions reveal something about itself. This recognition does not excuse behavior. It contextualizes it. Context transforms compulsion into choice. The shadow feels personal because it is personal. It is shaped by biographers, by early adaptation, by moments where parts of the self were deemed unacceptable. These moments leave traces. Every strong reaction carries memory, not necessarily of events, but of decisions made long ago. Don't be this. Don't feel that. Don't want this. The shadow remembers what the ego forgot. Integration does not require dredging up the past explicitly. It requires noticing the present. The present reaction is the doorway. When the ego learns to enter that doorway rather than slam it shut, the shadow loses its ability to ambush. The reaction becomes information. The emotion becomes signal. The discomfort becomes guide. This does not make life easier. It makes it truer. The shadow stops being an enemy and becomes a mirror, not a flattering one, but an honest one. And honesty, though unsettling, is the only condition under which psychological life can deepen without becoming destructive. The shadow feels personal because it belongs to you. When that ownership is accepted and no longer needs to announce itself so violently, it can speak more quietly. And quiet speech is how the psyche asks to be listened to, rather than fought. One of the deepest reasons the shadow is resisted is not morality. It is control. The ego fears that acknowledging the shadow will lead to chaos, that impulses will overwhelm restraint, that values will dissolve, that the personality will fragment. This fear is powerful because it contains a partial truth. Carl Jung never suggested that the shadow is safe. He suggested that it is inevitable. The danger lies not in knowing it, but in pretending it does not exist. The ego equates consciousness with control. To remain in control, it believes it must remain pure, consistent, and decisive. The shadow introduces ambiguity. It reveals impulses that do not align neatly with chosen values. This ambiguity feels like threat. If I admit this impulse, will I act on it? If I recognize this desire, will it consume me? If I see this capacity for harm, will it define me? These fears lead the ego to tighten. It suppresses harder, it moralizes more aggressively, it clings to rigid identity. Ironically, this tightening weakens control. Jung observed that what is repressed does not submit, it waits. Control based on denial is brittle. It functions only under ideal conditions. Under stress, fatigue, or emotional intensity, repression fails. What returns then is not the shadow as it is, but the shadow distorted. The ego's fear is therefore self-fulfilling. By refusing conscious contact, it ensures unconscious eruption. Real control does not come from denial. It comes from relationship. Relationship allows distance. When the ego can say, This impulse exists in me. Without acting on it or identifying with it, it creates space. In that space, choice becomes possible. This is the paradox, Jung emphasized. Acknowledging the shadow increases control. Denying it reduces control. The fear of losing control is also linked to identity. The ego worries that without its carefully constructed self-image, it will dissolve. But identity built on exclusion is fragile. It must constantly defend itself. An identity that includes contradiction is more stable. It does not need to fight reality. Jung believed that maturity involves replacing the illusion of control with containment. Containment means holding opposing impulses without resolving them prematurely. The ego learns to tolerate discomfort without acting it out. It allows desire to exist without indulgence. It allows anger to exist without violence. This tolerance is strength. It is not passivity. It is discipline informed by awareness. People who fear shadow integration often confuse awareness with permission. They assume that seeing something means endorsing it. Jung rejected this confusion. Consciousness does not compel action. Unconsciousness does. When the shadow is unconscious, it acts autonomously. When it is conscious, it becomes part of deliberation. Deliberation restores agency. The fear of losing control also reflects early adaptation. Many people learned that certain impulses led to punishment, rejection, or chaos. Suppression became necessary for survival. The psyche remembers this necessity. Shadow work threatens that memory. It suggests revisiting impulses that once felt dangerous. The ego resists to protect against perceived regression. Integration does not require returning to past chaos. It requires updating the psyche's understanding of present capacity. You are no longer the child who needed to suppress everything. You possess tools, now reflection, language, restraint, ethical understanding. The shadow does not know this unless it is met consciously. When met, it loses urgency. Jung warned against premature shadow confrontation. Forcing awareness without containment can overwhelm the ego. Integration must proceed gradually, at a pace the personality can tolerate. This is why shadow work is not a technique. It is an attitude of openness without surrender, an attitude of curiosity without indulgence, an attitude of humility without collapse. The ego does not lose control by recognizing the shadow. It loses illusion. What replaces illusion is something sturdier, a self that knows its limits, a morality that includes temptation, a strength that does not depend on denial. The fear of losing control fades as experience accumulates. The ego discovers, repeatedly, that awareness does not lead to disaster. It leads to clarity. The shadow does not seize power when named. It relaxes. It no longer needs to ambush. Control is restored not by tightening the grip, but by widening awareness. This is the kind of control that survives stress, the kind that does not shatter when certainty fails, the kind that allows the psyche to remain whole without pretending to be pure. The shadow challenges control so that true authority can emerge. Authority rooted not in repression, but in consciousness. And consciousness is the only force strong enough to hold the darkness without becoming it. The shadow does not usually speak in direct statements, it speaks in symbols. Carl Jung emphasized that the unconscious rarely communicates in clear concepts. It expresses itself through images, actions, mistakes, and stories forms that bypass the ego's defenses. This is why the shadow often appears where control is weakest. In dreams, in slips of the tongue, in jokes that go too far, in fantasies you would never admit publicly. These expressions feel accidental. Psychologically, they are not. Dreams are the shadow's most honest medium because the ego's censorship is relaxed. The personality that appears in dreams often behaves in ways that feel disturbing or unfamiliar. You may act aggressively, deceptively, or vulnerably in ways that contradict your wakened self-image. The ego wakes up unsettled. It wants to dismiss the dream as meaningless. Jung insisted that this dismissal is a mistake. Dream behavior reveals possibility, not intention. It shows what the psyche contains, not what it plans to enact. The shadow uses dreams to display what consciousness refuses to acknowledge. If anger is denied, it appears exaggerated. If desire is denied, it appears distorted. If power is denied, it appears symbolic. The ego's task is not to judge the dream self, but to listen to it. Slips of the tongue function similarly. A word escapes that was not intended. A joke reveals hostility disguised as humor. A comment lands harder than expected. These moments are often laughed off, yet they reveal fault lines in the persona. The ego says one thing, the shadow says another. When these voices diverge too sharply, the psyche leaks. Jung believed that humor is one of the shadow's preferred disguises. Humor allows unacceptable material to surface without direct confrontation. Cruelty, resentment, and superiority often ride inside jokes that feel harmless on the surface. This does not mean humor is wrong. It means humor is revealing. The ego learns much about its shadow by noticing what it finds, funny and why. Another language of the shadow is fantasy. Fantasies are often morally troubling because they are unregulated. They do not obey values or consistency. The ego tries to suppress them, fearing what they imply. Jung argued that fantasies are symbolic rehearsals, not confessions. They show psychic energy seeking form. When fantasies are ignored, they intensify. When they are moralized, they distort. When they are approached symbolically, they inform. The shadow also appears through repetitive patterns. The same mistake made in different contexts. The same type of conflict recurring in relationships. The same emotional outcome reached despite changed circumstances. These repetitions are not bad luck. They are communication attempts. The psyche repeats what the ego refuses to hear. Jung described these patterns as compensation. The unconscious compensates for one-sided conscious attitudes by producing experiences that force awareness. If the ego insists on control, chaos appears. If the ego insists on innocence, guilt appears. If the ego insists on rationality, irrational events intrude. The shadow does not argue. It demonstrates. This is why insight alone is insufficient. Understanding the concept of the shadow does not integrate it. Integration requires encounter. Encounter means staying present when the shadow appears, rather than retreating into explanation or judgment. A dream disturbs you, stay with it. A reaction surprises you, examine it. A mistake embarrasses you, reflect on it. These moments feel small. They are not. They are openings. Jung believed that consciousness expands, not through grand realizations, but through sustained attention to the ordinary ways the unconscious interrupts life. The ego often wants dramatic transformation. The shadow prefers incremental honesty. Learning the shadow's language means learning patience. It means resisting the urge to interpret too quickly. It means allowing images and reactions to work on you. It means accepting that meaning unfolds over time. When the ego listens, the shadow softens. It no longer needs to shout through symptoms or eruptions. It can speak through nuance. Dreams become less violent. Reactions become less extreme. Patterns begin to shift. This does not mean the shadow disappears. It means dialogue has begun. Dialogue is the goal, not mastery, not purity, not resolution. Dialogue keeps the psyche alive. The shadow's language is indirect because directness would overwhelm the ego. Symbols protect as much as they reveal. When the ego learns to respect this language, it gains access to information that was previously inaccessible. Information about desire, about fear, about unlived life. This information is not comfortable, but it is accurate. And accuracy, not comfort, is what allows the psyche to reorganize itself without violence. The shadow speaks all the time. The question is not whether it communicates. It is whether the ego is willing to listen without immediately trying to silence, excuse, or dominate the message. When listening begins, the shadow no longer needs to intrude. It becomes part of the conversation. And conversation is how the psyche moves from conflict toward coherence without pretending that darkness can be eliminated or that light alone is sufficient. The shadow's language is subtle, persistent, and honest. Learning to hear it is one of the most demanding and most transformative skills a person can develop. As the shadow becomes conscious, something shifts at the level of responsibility. Not external responsibility, rules, consequences, or reputation, but moral responsibility in its deepest sense. Carl Jung argued that true morality does not arise from innocence. It arises from awareness. A person who believes they are incapable of harm is not moral, they are untested. The shadow tests morality when the ego recognizes its own capacity for aggression, manipulation, envy, or cruelty. It loses the comfort of moral superiority. It can no longer claim purity. This loss feels destabilizing at first, but it produces something stronger. It produces restraint. A person who knows what they are capable of chooses differently than one who believes themselves incapable. Choice replaces denial. Responsibility replaces righteousness. This is why Jung insisted that integrating the shadow deepens ethics rather than undermining them. Moral rules followed out of fear or conformity collapse under pressure. Morality grounded in self-knowledge endures because it does not rely on illusion. Shadow integration removes excuses. You can no longer say, "I didn't know." You can no longer say, "That's not me." You know, and knowing changes how you act. This knowledge does not demand constant self-accusation. It demands vigilance. It asks the ego to remain aware of its own motivations, especially when certainty feels strongest. Certainty is where the shadow hides most easily. Jung observed that people often commit harm not when they feel conflicted, but when they feel absolutely right. Moral conviction, when unexamined, becomes a vehicle for shadow possession. Integration introduces hesitation. Hesitation is not weakness. It is reflection. Reflection slows action just enough to reintroduce choice. The ego no longer rushes to justify itself. It pauses to consider what impulse is active and what cost it carries. This pause is ethical. It allows the individual to take responsibility for their shadow without being ruled by it. Shadow integration also changes how guilt is experienced. Unconscious guilt is vague and paralyzing. It produces anxiety, self-punishment, or projection. Conscious guilt is specific. It relates to actual actions and real consequences. Specific guilt can be addressed. Vague guilt cannot. By bringing the shadow into awareness, the psyche replaces diffuse shame with concrete responsibility. This is a relief, not a burden. You are no longer haunted by what you refuse to see. You are accountable for what you know. This accountability does not make life simpler. It makes it honest. Jung believed that honesty with oneself is the foundation of any ethical life that can withstand complexity. Without it, morality becomes performance, a persona rather than a lived orientation. The integrated shadow prevents this performance. It keeps morality grounded in reality rather than idealization. This grounding is especially important in relationships. When the shadow is owned, blame diminishes. Conflict becomes specific rather than total. You can admit fault without collapsing into self-loathing. You can set boundaries without demonizing the other. This balance is rare because it requires tolerating imperfection, your own and others. Jung did not expect people to become morally flawless. He expected them to become morally conscious. Conscious morality is quieter. It does not announce itself. It does not seek validation. It does not need enemies. It is expressed in restraint, humility, and consistency over time. Shadow integration also restores dignity. When you know what you are capable of and still choose responsibly, your actions carry weight. They are not reflexes. They are decisions. This weight gives life seriousness, not heaviness, but significance. The shadow, once integrated, no longer undermines morality. It supports it. It reminds you that ethics is not about appearing good, but about choosing well in the presence of temptation, fear, and power. That choice is meaningful precisely because the alternative is possible. Jung believed that this is where psychological maturity intersects with moral life, not in purity, but in accountability, not in certainty, but in reflection, not in denying darkness, but in refusing to let it rule unconsciously. Shadow integration does not absolve you. It makes you responsible, and responsibility, when freely accepted, is not a burden. It is the foundation of a life that can be trusted by others and endured by oneself. This is the quiet outcome of shadow work, not transformation into something better, but the capacity to choose consciously in a world where unconsciousness is always tempting. That capacity is fragile. It must be renewed daily. But it is the only kind of morality that does not collapse when life becomes difficult, and difficulty is inevitable. The shadow ensures that integration determines whether it destroys or disciplines the soul. The shadow does not disappear at the end of psychological work. It becomes included. Carl Jung warned against confusing wholeness with goodness. Wholeness is not the absence of darkness. It is the capacity to live with it consciously. This distinction matters. Many people approach shadow work with an unspoken hope that once the shadow is understood, life will become lighter, cleaner, more peaceful. When this does not happen, they assume they have failed. Jung argued the opposite. If shadow work is done honestly, life becomes more complex, not less. Contradictions remain. Temptations persist. Ambivalence deepens. What changes is not the content of the psyche, but the ego's relationship to it. Wholeness does not eliminate conflict. It contains it. A whole personality is not morally pure. It is psychologically spacious. It can hold opposing tendencies without collapsing into denial or acting them out blindly. This spaciousness is maturity. It allows you to be ethical without illusion, compassionate without naivete, strong without cruelty. It replaces the fantasy of perfection with the reality of responsibility. Jung believed that the greatest danger to psychological life is not darkness, but one-sidedness. When the ego identifies exclusively with light, the shadow grows monstrous. When it identifies exclusively with instinct, consciousness collapses. Wholeness lives in the tension between. This tension never resolves permanently. It must be carried. Carrying tension is uncomfortable. It means resisting easy answers. It means refusing to simplify yourself or others. It means accepting that you are capable of harm and still choosing care. This choice does not feel heroic, it feels ordinary. And that ordinariness is the mark of integration. The integrated shadow does not announce itself. It shows up quietly in restraint where impulse once ruled, in humility where certainty once dominated, in patience where reaction once erupted. Life does not become safer. It becomes truer. Jung believed that truthfulness to the psyche is the only protection against self-deception. Without it, people become possessed by ideals they cannot live up to or demons they refuse to face. Wholeness dismantles both fantasies. You are neither purely good nor irredeemably dark. You are human. This humanity carries limits. You will fail. You will react unconsciously at times. You will hurt others and be hurt. Shadow integration does not prevent this. It changes what happens next. You can reflect rather than justify. You can repair rather than project. You can learn rather than repeat. This capacity to learn from one's own darkness is what prevents repetition from becoming fate. Jung believed that societies, like individuals, fail when they seek purity. Purity demands exclusion. Exclusion generates shadow. Shadow eventually erupts. Wholeness demands inclusion, inclusion of contradiction, inclusion of difference, inclusion of uncomfortable truth. This does not weaken moral life. It grounds it. A grounded morality does not require enemies to exist. It does not need scapegoats to function. It does not collapse when certainty fails. It rests on awareness. At the individual level, this awareness transforms identity. You are no longer defined by what you show or suppress, but by how you relate to what you contain. The shadow becomes a companion rather than a threat. It reminds you of your limits. It keeps your judgments tentative. It anchors your ethics in reality rather than image. This companionship is not pleasant. It is honest, and honesty is what allows psychological life to remain dynamic rather than rigid, ethical rather than self-rigid, and human rather than idealized. Jung never promised salvation through psychology. He offered orientation toward a self that is not perfect, but whole enough to live without illusion. The shadow is part of that self. It refuses to die because it carries life that consciousness alone cannot contain. When that life is acknowledged, related to, and held responsibly, it no longer needs to sabotage or possess. It participates. And participation, rather than domination or denials, what allows the psyche to move forward without tearing itself apart. Wholeness is not purity. It is the courage to remain conscious in the presence of darkness. That courage does not announce itself. It simply chooses, again and again, not to look away.